Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. The night my dad called, his voice lacked the certainty that once cut me with one sentence. You need to learn independence. He wasn't lecturing now. Their house faced foreclosure over debts signed for my pampered sister. The daughter, once denied enough money for heat, was now the only one who could read the contracts. I simply opened a folder, ready to show him that true independence means no longer being someone else's landing pad. My name is Giarner Simmons. I am 34 years old. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine idling in the parking lot of a small nondescript law office. The sky above was the color of wet cement, a heavy, oppressive gray that seemed to press down on the roof of my car. My hands rested perfectly still on the steering wheel, wrapped in the quiet hum of the heater blowing warm air across my knuckles. Next to me, sitting alone on the dark leather of the passenger seat, my phone lit up. The vibration buzzed against the upholstery, harsh and demanding. A name flashed across the glowing glass screen. Dean Simmons, my father. We had not spoken a real, meaningful sentence to each other in over 12 months. For an entire year, our relationship had been surgically reduced to a handful of sterile obligatory text messages, a generic happy birthday, a copy-pasted Merry Christmas, a thumbs-up emoji in response to a life update I had stopped caring if he read. Nothing more, nothing with substance. I watched the screen glow, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air of the cabin. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. The screen remained bright, stubbornly demanding my attention, a digital intruder in my quiet sanctuary. I pressed the green button, swiped my thumb across the glass, and lifted the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I just breathed in the recycled air of my car and waited for him to cross the bridge he had burned. Gianner. His voice crackled through the speaker. It was a heavy voice, the kind of voice that usually occupied a room without ever asking for permission, the kind of voice that gave orders disguised as friendly advice. But today, the edges of that voice were frayed. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I was healthy, if I was eating well, or if my job at the property services firm was treating me decently. He did not mention the vast empty expanse of the past 365 days of total silence between us. He went straight to the center of the wound, bypassing any pretense of fatherly affection or casual small talk. We have a situation, he said. His breathing was slightly uneven, a fraction too fast. The house, your mother and I, we are facing some trouble with the bank foreclosure. He paused. He was waiting for a gasp, a cry of shock, some emotional parachute to deploy from my end of the line. He was waiting for the dutiful oldest daughter to panic on his behalf. I gave him nothing, only the absolute dead silence of the car's interior. He cleared his throat and continued, the gravel in his voice slipping slightly as the silence stretched too long. It is bad, Giarner. I need you to lend a hand. We need your help. Help. The word hung in the sterile air of my car, heavy and toxic. It did not sound like a request. It sounded like an expectation, a tax he was trying to collect from a citizen he had previously exiled. Hearing that specific 4-letter word from his mouth felt like a rusted physical mechanism locking violently into place inside my chest. Instantly, the gray parking lot vanished from my vision. My mind snapped backward, pulled relentlessly into the freezing, unforgiving depths of a winter exactly 1 year prior. It had been the coldest January on state record. I was standing in the middle of my cramped, freezing apartment. The central heating unit had died 3 days prior, and the landlord was dragging his feet. My breath bloomed in thick white clouds in front of my own face every time I exhaled. I was wearing 2 sweaters and a heavy winter coat indoors. My bank account was overdrawn by $42 due to an unexpected emergency car repair. A massive late fee from my rent was looming, ready to trigger an automatic eviction notice process. The electric company had already sent their final brightly colored warning printed on heavy card stock. I had calculated everything down to the final penny. I needed exactly $2,400, not to buy luxury items, not to invest in some flashy pipe dream, not to fund a vacation, just a short-term 60-day bridge loan to keep the lights on, the gas flowing, and a roof over my head until my delayed corporate payroll finally processed through the chaotic restructuring at my company. I had swallowed every single ounce of pride I possessed. I picked up the phone. I called the man who had raised me, the man who lived in a spacious, perfectly heated suburban home. I laid out the math clearly. I'd explained the timeline. I offered a strict repayment schedule with interest. I was not asking for a handout. I was asking for a temporary lifeline. I remember the silence on the other end of the line, that winter night. It was a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against my eardrum. Dean did not yell. He did not curse. He did not claim he was broke or lacked the funds. Instead, he spoke with a terrifying smooth calmness. It was the tone of a judge delivering a predetermined, entirely righteous sentence. "You need to learn independence." Those were his exact words. 6 words. They sliced through the freezing air of my apartment and severed something vital, something fundamental inside my chest. He said it with the serene confidence of a man teaching a necessary moral lesson to a wayward child. The casual cruelty of his calmness was what made it entirely unforgivable. I did not argue. I did not scream into the receiver. I did not try to justify my existence or my crisis. I did not let a single tear fall while the line was connected. I simply stood there, my numb, stiff fingers clutching the cheap plastic of the phone, my eyes locked onto the bright pink past due notice taped to my cheap laminate kitchen counter. The silence stretched between us. The lesson was delivered. "I understand," I replied. My voice was a hollow, unrecognizable echo of myself. I hung up the phone. I spent the next 2 nights sleeping on the hardwood floor of my boyfriend's cramped apartment just to keep from freezing to death, wrapping myself in whatever blankets we could find. "Gianna, are you there?" My father's voice dragged me violently back to the present moment. The heater in my car was still humming quietly. I was warm now, very warm. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was 2:00 in the afternoon. "It is just a rough patch," Dean continued, misinterpreting my prolonged silence for shock or perhaps familial concern. "A temporary setback. Your sister had some bad luck with the business. The market shifted unexpectedly. The vendors are being unreasonable. We just need someone who understands these complicated legal contracts to step in, take a look, and sort out the mess." He was using it again. As I listened to the cadence of his voice, I realized he was using that exact same calm, composed tone he used on me a year ago. The patronizing rhythm of a man who believes he is simply managing a minor inconvenience. The only difference was the subject matter. This time the ground was crumbling beneath his own feet. The person about to lose their sanctuary, their warmth, and their dignity was not me. It was him. And the person who caused it was the golden child, my sister, who never once had to learn the lesson he so graciously forced down my throat. I felt no sudden surge of rage. Rage requires passion. Rage requires an expectation of love, a hope that things might change. I had none of that left for him. I felt entirely perfectly empty. My mind was cold, sharp, and functioning with absolute clarity. I was no longer a desperate daughter seeking warmth. I was a professional who read contracts for a living, a woman who knew exactly how to spot a bad deal. I did not agree to help him. I did not refuse to help him. I let him speak his piece, letting the subtle desperation bleed through the cracks in his composed, patriarchal facade. "Do not ask me for anything right now," I said. My voice was remarkably level. It was flat, professional, and devoid of any familial warmth. "Scan every single document you have, the mortgage agreement, the default notices from the bank, the lines of credit, the personal guarantees you signed for her, everything. Email the entire file to my personal address. I will review the paperwork and assess the damage before I decide whether or not we are going to have a meeting about this." He started to protest, his voice kitching up a fraction of an inch to offer an excuse, to soften the blow of my clinical demands. "Diana, honey, it is just a simple misunderstanding with the lenders. We just need a minute to figure things out." I ended the call. I did not say goodbye. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting him off mid-sentence. The silence rushed back into the car, thick and satisfying. I set the phone down gently on the passenger's seat. I reached into the back seat and pulled my heavy leather laptop bag forward. I unzipped the main compartment, pulled out the sleek silver machine, and flipped it open on my steering wheel. The screen flared to life, casting a stark, uncompromising white light against my face. I navigated to my file directory. I right-clicked the trackpad. I created a new folder directly on the center of the desktop. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment, thinking about the cold winter, the past due notices, and the 6 words that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life. I placed my fingers on the keys. I typed a single word to name the empty folder: independence. To understand how a family ends up mortgaging their entire existence for a failing beauty clinic, you have to understand the specific type of soil they grew up in. The Simmons family lived in a sprawling 2-story colonial house in the quiet suburbs of Fizers, Indiana. It was a neighborhood built on the absolute illusion of stability. The lawns were edged with military precision every Thursday afternoon. The trash cans were promptly rolled back into the garages by 6:00 every Friday evening. Our house had vinyl siding the color of wheat tea and a driveway without a single oiled stain. From the sidewalk, looking in through the pristine bay windows, we were the quintessential, perfectly reliable American middle-class family. Inside those walls, love was not absent. It was not a cruel or actively malicious household. The love was simply treated as a highly concentrated, finite resource, and I was definitively not the designated beneficiary. I was the eldest daughter. In our family dynamic, that title meant I was less of a child and more of a self-sustaining household appliance. I was the kid who folded my own laundry before anyone had to ask. I started packing my own school lunches by the time I was in the 5th grade. I completed my homework in silence at the kitchen island while my mother cooked, never needing help with algebra or history. The quieter I was, the more flawlessly I functioned, the more completely invisible I became. My good behavior was not rewarded. It was merely expected, a baseline of competence that required no parental maintenance. Then there was Piper. Piper was exactly 3 years younger than me, but in terms of family real estate, she occupied an entirely different solar system. Piper possessed golden hair, a loud, infectious laugh, and an exhausting perpetual need for rescue. She did not just have casual hobbies. She had grand dramatic passions that required immediate and heavy financial backing. Piper was the center of gravity, and my parents were her willing, dizzy satellites. The unspoken rule of the Simmons house was established early and enforced with rigid consistency. If Piper wanted something, my parents classified it as an investment in her limitless potential. If I needed something, it was classified as a necessary lesson in adulthood. I remember the cars. When I turned 17, I got a job bagging groceries at a local supermarket. I worked 20 hours a week during the school year and 40 hours a week during the summer. It took me 2 full years of hoarding every single paycheck to save $1,500. I bought a rusted, faded blue sedan that smelled faintly of damp upholstery and violently pulled to the left whenever I tapped the brakes. When I proudly parked it in the driveway, my parents patted me on the back, smiled, and called it a fantastic character-building achievement. When Piper turned 17, she did not have a part-time job. Instead, she developed a sudden intense anxiety about riding the school bus because a girl in her homeroom had made a sarcastic comment about her jacket. 2 weeks later, my parents co-signed a loan for a pristine 3-year-old silver hatchback with a sunroof and leather seats. When I quietly asked my father about the glaring disparity, he did not even blink. Piper has to drive all the way across town for her new dance rehearsals. Dean reasoned, his voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of irony. We cannot have her breaking down on the side of the highway in the dark. You are resourceful, Giarner. You know how to check your own oil and change a tire. She does not. There it was. The fundamental truth laid bare. My competence was the very weapon they used to justify neglecting me. My mother, Marlene, was not an evil woman plotting the downfall of her eldest child. But Marlene was an emotional addict. She was utterly addicted to the intoxicating rush of being a savior. She needed a fragile bird with a broken wing to nurse back to health, to fuss over, to feel vital and necessary. I was born with titanium wings, or at least I was forced to forge them myself out of necessity. I never gave her the deep satisfaction of a full-blown crisis. Piper, however, was a professional crisis manufacturer. She provided my mother with a constant, reliable stream of minor tragedies. A dramatic breakup, a failed midterm exam, a sudden tearful shift in her life goals. Marlene would swoop in instantly with her vanilla-scented candles, her open checkbook, and her boundless, suffocating sympathy. Piper played the role of the beautiful, delicate victim with Oscar-worthy precision, and my mother ate it up every single time. This toxic dynamic fully crystallized after we left high school. I did not bother asking for university tuition. I already knew the script. I enrolled in the local community college. I scheduled my classes for early mornings and late evenings so I could work 35 hours a week as a data entry clerk at a medical billing firm. I paid for my own heavy textbooks. I paid for my own gas. I bought my own groceries. Meanwhile, Piper dramatically declared that a traditional college environment would completely stifle her creative spirit. She announced she needed to attend a specialized, highly exclusive cosmetology academy in the city. The tuition was staggering. My parents did not hesitate. They drained a massive portion of their retirement savings to pay for her first year upfront. Piper lasted exactly 4 months before deciding that touching strangers' scalps gave her anxiety. She dropped out. The thousands of dollars were instantly gone. There were zero consequences, no lectures, no demands for repayment. 6 months later, Piper discovered a brand new salaloot passion for high-end skincare. My parents simply nodded, opened another line of credit, and cheerfully paid for a terribly expensive esthetician program to clear the path for her. They called it a journey of self-discovery. I called it a financial hemorrhage. I remember a specific Tuesday evening dinner during that era. I was 19 years old. I had just finished a brutal 9-hour shift at the billing firm, followed by a 3-hour macroeconomics lecture. My back throbbed and my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. I sat at the dining room table quietly eating a plate of reheated chicken. Piper, who was 16 at the time and had spent the entire day lounging by the neighborhood community pool, was holding court. She was passionately explaining her sudden, desperate need for a professional-grade photography camera. She had decided with absolute conviction that she was destined to become a highly paid fashion influencer. My mother leaned forward, her eyes wide with rapt attention, completely ignoring her own meal. "Oh, honey, you have such a wonderful eye for color and lighting," Marling cooed softly. Dean was already calculating the cost in his head, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "A good camera is a solid necessary investment in your personal brand," he agreed, reaching for his water glass. I sat there entirely invisible in my own home. I did not mention that my rusted car desperately needed new brake pads, a necessary repair that would cost me 2 full weeks of my meager wages. I knew exactly what would happen if I spoke up. I would be accused of ruining the mood. I would be the pragmatic buzzkill, the jealous older sister raining on Piper's parade. So I chewed my cold chicken in absolute silence and listened to my parents negotiate the financing of a $1,000 camera that Piper would ultimately abandon in a hallway closet exactly 6 weeks later. And through all of this, through every broken promise and every wasted dollar, there was Dean. My father was the chief architect of our family's twisted mythology. Whenever the glaring, painful inequality of our treatment was accidentally brought into the light, he had a perfectly polished psychological shield ready to deploy. "You are the strongest person in this house, Diarner," he would say, looking at me with a sickening mixture of pride and profound relief. For a very long time, when I was young and foolish, I thought that was a compliment. I genuinely thought being the strong one was a badge of honor to wear proudly. It took me stepping out of that house, moving into my own freezing apartment, and facing the cold, indifferent reality of adulthood to understand the actual truth. In the Simmons family, being called strong was never a compliment. It was a utility. It was a polite, socially acceptable excuse for them to wash their hands of any responsibility toward me. If I was strong, I did not need a safety net. If I was strong, they could pour every single ounce of their energy, their money, and their unconditional love into the bottomless echoing pit of Piper's manufactured fragility without feeling a single shred of parental guilt. I was not the beloved eldest child. I was the load-bearing wall they never had to paint, inspect, or even think about. I was just the solid foundation they comfortably ignored, right up until the exact moment their own roof finally started caving in. I moved out of the suburban bubble of Pfizer's, Indiana, precisely 2 months after my 21st birthday. While Piper was still discovering her ever-shifting passions on my parents' dime, I was navigating the bleak landscape of temporary office jobs, learning the precise market value of a reliable typist. Eventually, the chaotic string of temporary gigs solidified into a permanent desk at Astral Property Services. I landed in the contract management division. It was an industry built entirely on the fine print, the hidden clauses, and the absolute worst-case scenarios. Astor Vale was not a glamorous place to spend 40 hours a week. The office carpets were a depressing shade of industrial gray. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low head-shing frequency, and the break-room coffee always tasted faintly of burnt copper. But it offered something I had never truly experienced: total, unshakable predictability. I did not make a staggering six-figure salary, but I possessed a comprehensive health insurance plan. I had a dental plan. I had a rigid Monday through Friday schedule that never asked me to sacrifice my evenings. Most importantly, I had my meticulously color-coded Excel spreadsheets. On my personal laptop, I tracked every single dollar that entered and exited my life. I categorized my grocery budget down to the final cent. I allocated exactly $50 a month to a dining out fund. I had an emergency savings account that grew by exactly $175 every 2 weeks via an automatic transfer. The balance was modest, but it was mine. It was a small, aggressively controlled financial universe where no one could suddenly change the rules or demand a withdrawal based on an emotional whim. However, physical distance and financial independence did not sever my utility to the Simmons family. Moving into my own apartment did not stop me from being the designated administrative engine of the household. My parents treated my adulthood not as a boundary to be respected, but as a newly acquired set of professional skills they could freely exploit. If my mother, Marlene, needed to undergo a minor routine surgical procedure, Piper was invariably deemed too sensitive and too overwhelmed by the harsh clinical environment of a hospital to drive her. So, I would use my fiercely guarded paid time off to sit in sterile waiting rooms reading ancient magazines while Piper sent generic prayer emojis to the family group chat. If Dean received a complex, deliberately confusing medical bill that his insurance company refused to cover, he did not call the provider to argue. He simply dropped the crumpled envelope on my kitchen counter during a brief visit and asked me to decipher the billing codes. I was the unpaid, unthanking translator of reality. I read the agonizingly long terms of service. I navigated the hostile, automated phone menus of utility companies. I drafted the sternly worded emails to correct erroneous charges on my father's credit cards. I fixed the errors and handed them back their neatly resolved, stress-free lives. I was so deeply conditioned to play the role of the load-bearing pillar that I did it almost automatically. Meanwhile, Piper was busy cultivating the grand, sweeping aesthetic of a successful female entrepreneur. Her career trajectory was a dizzying, incredibly expensive sequence of sudden pivots. First came the boutique lash bar. It lasted exactly 9 months before she shuttered the doors, claiming the overhead fluorescent lighting was destroying her circadian rhythm. Next was a high-end facial studio leased in a trendy, newly gentrified downtown district. When the wealthy free-spending clientele failed to materialize, she pivoted again with breathtaking speed. The new ultimate vision was a luxury medical spa. She talked endlessly about intravenous vitamin drips, imported laser skin resurfacing machines, and curating a holistic wellness journey for elite clients. She posted heavily filtered photographs on social media, posing with a glass of champagne in empty, half-renovated commercial spaces, typing long captions filled with buzzwords about grinding, manifesting success, and silencing the doubters. Dean and Marlene were solidly middle class. They were not venture capitalists with disposable income. Yet, when Piper pitched her luxury medical spa, my parents magically transformed into a bottomless, unconditional line of credit. They quietly cashed out the bulk of their modest retirement savings, swallowing the massive early withdrawal penalties without a second thought because they believed in her vision. When that cash burned away, they marched into their local bank branch and signed the heavy, terrifying paperwork for a massive home equity line of credit. They essentially gambled the roof over their own heads, the house they had lived in for 3 decades on a business plan written on the back of a metaphorical napkin. They acted as personal guarantors on commercial equipment leases that ran into the tens of thousands of dollars. Whenever I visited for a mandatory Sunday dinner, Dean would puff out his chest and confidently declare that Piper was right on the cusp of a massive financial breakthrough. He firmly believed she was one viral marketing campaign away from paying them back entirely, buying them a beach house, and proving her genius to the world. I saw the frayed edges of the illusion perfectly clearly. I saw the thick stacks of unopened red, stamped mail piling up on their entryway table. I saw the subtle, panicked tightness around my mother's eyes when the topic of interest rates came up on the evening news. But I kept my mouth firmly shut. I did not give them a harsh reality check. I did not point out the absurd, staggering failure rate of independent aesthetic clinics. I sat at their dining table, chewed my dry pot roast, and nodded politely. I had spent my entire life playing the silent, perfectly functional background character. To suddenly step forward and demand they look at the ugly truth felt like trying to speak a foreign language. It was far easier to just let them live inside the delusion. My only genuine refuge from the exhausting theater of the Simmons family was Rowan Mercer. We met during a chaotic Tuesday afternoon at Astor Vale when the main server room experienced a critical power failure. Rowan was the union electrician dispatched to fix the mess. He was a broad-shouldered, quiet man with calloused hands, ingrained with faint traces of wire dust and a slight permanent scowl that softened only when he looked directly at me. He possessed a deep fundamental respect for systems that functioned properly and a quiet abiding disdain for things that were purely decorative. Rowan did not try to fix me. When I told him stories about my family, he did not offer unsolicited psychological advice. He never urged me to aggressively confront my father or demand a tearful apology from my mother. He simply listened, his jaw set, absorbing the information without judgment. His apartment was small, filled with sturdy, mismatched thrift store furniture, but it was safe. It was the only place on earth where absolutely nothing was required of me. The profound clarity of his perspective struck me on a rainy Thursday evening. I was sitting at his small kitchen table, staring blankly at my laptop screen. I had just spent 2 agonizingly tedious hours untangling a complicated property tax dispute for my father, meticulously drafting a formal letter of appeal because Dean claimed the legal jargon gave him a severe migraine. I finally hit send, closed the laptop, and let my heavy head fall into my hands, rubbing my burning eyes. Rowan walked over from the stove and placed a steaming ceramic mug of black tea directly in front of me. He pulled out the wooden chair opposite mine and sat down. He looked at my exhausted, defeated posture for a long time. The rain tapped steadily against the window pane, a rhythmic, isolating sound. "They always say I am the strong one," I muttered bitterly, tracing the rim of the warm mug with my index finger, not looking up at him. "They say I can handle the heavy lifting. That is why they never ask Piper to do these things, because I am strong." Rowan shook his head slowly. His expression was completely devoid of pity, replaced entirely by a piercing, undeniable clarity that stripped away decades of my parents' carefully constructed excuses. "You have it wrong, Gianner," he said gently, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet kitchen. "Your family does not need you to be strong. They need you to be easy to dismiss." The collapse did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing cascade of ordinary disasters, the kind that only crush you when you are already living exactly at the edge of your means. It began in the dead of winter during a week when the wind howled off the plains and the temperature refused to rise above freezing. At Astor Vale Property Services, an upper management decision to restructure the corporate payroll system resulted in a catastrophic administrative glitch. My guaranteed predictable direct deposit was delayed by 2 full weeks. I had built my entire adult life around that rigid spreadsheet, tracking every penny with militant precision, and suddenly the foundation was simply gone. Then the physical world decided to join the assault. The ancient rattling furnace in my apartment gave out on a Tuesday night. I woke up shivering violently, my breath pluming in the dark room like thick white smoke. My landlord, a notoriously cheap man who viewed property maintenance as a personal insult, finally agreed to send an emergency repair technician, but he legally passed the exorbitant after-hours service fee directly onto my next rent statement. 2 days later, my battered sedan started making a terrifying metallic grinding noise on my way home from the grocery store. The mechanic at the corner garage looked at me with genuine pity and explained that the entire front wheel assembly was shot. Driving it was a death trap. Fixing it required money I simply did not possess. I sat at my small kitchen table wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Staring at my notebook, I wrote down the numbers, the delayed paycheck, the emergency heating fee, the exorbitant car repair estimate, the impending rent and utility bills. I added them up, subtracted my meager, already depleted emergency fund, and stared at the final, terrifying deficit. I needed exactly $2,400. It was not a fortune. It was not seed money for a vanity project. It was the precise mathematical difference between keeping my life intact and a total unroverable freefall. For the first time in my independent life, I exhausted every other option. I swallowed the thick, bitter lump of pride lodged in my throat, picked up my phone, and called my father. I did not call him crying. I treated it like a pitch to a hostile client. I laid out the exact circumstances with total transparency. I explained the corporate payroll glitch, the broken furnace, the ruined car. I emphasized over and over that I was not asking for a gift or a handout. I explicitly asked for a 60-day loan. I told him I had already drafted a strict repayment schedule. I would pay him back in full with interest. The moment Astor Vale processed the backay, I just needed a temporary bridge to get across the freezing water. I finished my pitch and waited. The silence on the line was profound. It stretched for several long seconds, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the faint ambient noise of a television playing in the background of his warm, comfortable suburban house. When Dean finally spoke, he did not sound worried. He did not sound like a father hearing his daughter was sitting in a freezing apartment, terrified of losing her footing. He sounded like a disappointed guidance counselor delivering a pre-written moral lecture. "You need to learn independence," he said. There was no anger in his voice, just that terrifying smooth calmness. He delivered the sentence and let it hang in the air, a final unappealable verdict. I did not argue. I did not beg. The sheer, freezing audacity of his statement paralyzed my vocal cords. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the screen to end the call. I sat in the silent, frigid kitchen for a very long time, listening to the wind rattle the thin glass of my window panes. Realizing that my survival was entirely my own problem, the consequences of that refusal were immediate and fiercely physical. 3 days later, my utility provider implemented a rolling restriction protocol due to the missed payment. My electricity was cut off for a few hours every single evening, plunging my apartment into absolute freezing darkness right when the temperature dropped the lowest. The cold seeped into my bones, a deep, aching chill that no amount of clothing could fix. I spent 2 nights huddled on the cramped sofa in Rowan's apartment, trembling under his heavy union-made quilts, too humiliated to fully explain the absolute depth of my family's betrayal. Rowan held me tight, brewing hot tea and never asking the agonizing questions that would force me to say the pathetic words out loud. The physical cold was agonizing, but it was not the thing that finally killed the last lingering traces of hope inside me. That execution was carried out digitally, bathed in the cheerful artificial light of a smartphone screen. It was a Friday evening. I was sitting in the dim glow of my laptop at a local coffee shop, desperately searching for weekend freelance contract work to scrape together some cash when my mother's social media post appeared at the top of my feed. It was a high-resolution photograph of Pipa. She was standing on a manicured city sidewalk, wearing a pristine Desire winter coat, flashing a radiant Victoria smile. Behind her was a massive, beautifully frosted glass storefront. Above the door, a sleek custom-made sign read, "Or a luxury matter" in elegant gold leaf lettering. The caption my mother had written below, the photo felt like a physical blunt force blow to my chest. "So incredibly proud of our youngest girl today. The grand opening is finally here. Dad and I always knew you had greatness in you. Thank you for letting us be a part of your journey. We believe in your dream." I stared at the glowing pixels until my eyes burned. The warmth of the coffee shop suddenly felt suffocating, thick with a nauseating reality. My mother had typed those enthusiastic words while knowing perfectly well that I was sleeping in a coat because my power was being restricted. The final devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place a few days later. An acquaintance from high school who happened to work as a commercial underwriter at a local regional bank ran into me at a grocery store. After exchanging awkward pleasantries in the produce aisle, she casually mentioned my family. She assumed I was deeply involved in Piper's grand new venture. She smiled, totally oblivious to the grim reality of my life, and casually complimented my parents on their incredible, unwavering generosity. She mentioned the massive stack of paperwork she had personally processed. She mentioned the staggering, undeniable numbers that my parents had legally attached their names to. While I was sitting in the dark, shivering in 2 sweaters, begging for a temporary bridge loan just to fix my broken car and keep the heat running, Dean and Marlene had been sitting in a warm, brightly lit bank office. They had signed away their remaining financial security. They had legally guaranteed a massive commercial equipment financing loan to purchase imported aesthetic lasers along with a multi-year retail lease agreement for Piper's prime real estate. The total amount they had enthusiastically co-signed for was nearly $92,000. They had committed $92,000 to fund a high-risk vanity project for a girl who had never held a real job for more than 12 consecutive months. They did this at the exact same moment my father told me that lending me $2,400 to survive a genuine winter emergency would ruin my moral character and stunt my personal growth. I did not cry when I heard that staggering number. The sadness simply evaporated, flash frozen into something entirely different, something hard and sharp. It was a profound, chilling clarity. The illusion of my family was completely gone, leaving behind nothing but the stark, undeniable architecture of their favoritism. The debt between us was no longer just a matter of ignored feelings or missed birthdays. It was tangible. It was written on bank ledgers and commercial leases. I finally understood exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never ever ask them for anything again. I did not write a long dramatic email. I did not drive to my parents' suburban house to deliver a tearful monologue about fairness, betrayal, or the profound cruelty of their neglect. The movies always portray family estrangement as a loud explosive event, a sudden and violent shattering of glass. But my exit was entirely silent. I simply stopped being the invisible engine that kept their daily lives running smoothly. I took my hands off the machine, stepped back, and let it operate on its own. The first month of my withdrawal was marked strictly by the things I did not do. When Sunday evening rolled around, the designated time for our weekly catch-up, I did not dial their landline. I sat on my second-hand sofa, listening to the muffled traffic of the city outside my window, and let the clock tick past 7:00, then 8:00, then 9:00. My phone remained dark and silent on the coffee table. On a Tuesday shortly after the New Year, my mother had a scheduled moderately complex follow-up appointment with her specialist. Normally, I would have texted her at exactly noon, asking for a detailed update on what the doctor said, ready to translate the medical jargon for her. This time, I kept my phone in my desk drawer at Astor Vale and continued drafting a spreadsheet. When the gilded invitations for Piper's grand opening arrived in my mail, printed on impossibly thick cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering, I did not RSVP. I did not send a generic bouquet of congratulatory flowers. I did not even open the envelope all the way before dropping it directly into the kitchen recycling bin. When my father forwarded me a convoluted, legally aggressive email from a local contractor trying to overcharge him for driveway paving, implicitly expecting me to draft a legally sound, intimidating response on his behalf. As I'd always did, I simply highlighted the message and clicked delete. I waited for the backlash. I braced myself for the angry phone calls, the guilt trips, the harsh accusations of being a bitter, unsupportive daughter who was jealous of her sister's success. But the most devastating realization of my entire adult life arrived not with a bang, but with an absolute deafening silence. At first, no one even noticed. For nearly 6 weeks, my total absence went completely unremarked upon. They did not call to check if I was sick. They did not notice that the administrative friction in their lives had suddenly drastically increased. That realization hurt infinitely more than my father's cruel words during the winter freeze. It stripped away the final pathetic emotional illusion I had been desperately clinging to. I was never a beloved member of the inner family circle. I was just the household utility. When you flip a light switch and the bulb burns out, you do not mourn the bulb. You just get annoyed that the room is temporarily dark and assume you will eventually get around to replacing it. My family simply assumed I would eventually turn back on. I did not have the luxury of wallowing in that specific hollow grief. I was still drowning in the financial aftermath of my winter crisis. The hole was deep, and to climb out I had to work. I leveraged my daytime experience at the property services firm and began taking unquiet, grueling freelance work late into the night. I scoured local business forums and offered my contract review services to small-time commercial landlords, independent business owners, and local suppliers who could not afford expensive corporate retainer attorneys. I reviewed incredibly dense commercial leases. I built complex invoice reconciliation tables for a man who owned 3 aging strip malls on the industrial edge of the city. I audited vendor contracts for a local restaurant group that suspected their meat suppliers were subtly skimming off the top. I sat at my small kitchen table and worked until 2 or 3:00 in the morning. My eyes constantly burned against the glaring blue light of the laptop screen, fueled entirely by cheap black coffee and pure unadulterated necessity. I slept perhaps 4 hours a night, but in those quiet, desperate hours of the early morning, surrounded by towering stacks of paper and empty mugs, something remarkable happened. I discovered my actual talent. I possessed a hypervigilant eye for structural weakness. I could scan a 50-page vendor agreement and spot the exact, buried clause where the financial liability was unfairly shifted onto my client. I could look at a massive ledger of operating expenses and instantly see the illogical numbers, the slight deliberate inflations meant to pad a profit margin over a period of 12 months. I learned how to identify the smooth, polite lies dressed up in legal jargon and corporate letterheads. My family had unknowingly trained me to meticulously scan my environment for danger and manage their hidden liabilities. I was now turning that trauma-induced hypervigilance into a highly marketable, highly lethal professional skill. My work was immaculate. Word began to spread among my small pool of freelance clients. 8 months into my grueling 2-job routine, one of my clients made a phone call on my behalf. He was a gruff but wealthy property developer who had saved tens of thousands of dollars because of a tiny deliberate discrepancy I found hidden in a massive waste management contract. He told me about Helm Ridge Vendor Solutions. Helm Ridge was a mid-sized, aggressively expanding corporate firm that specialized entirely in contract risk control and cost management. Their primary clients were massive regional healthcare networks and logistics companies. They were the people a corporation hired when they knew they were bleeding millions of dollars but could not figure out which financial artery was severed. My client called one of their senior partners and secured me an interview. I walked into their sleek glass-walled conference room on a rainy Wednesday morning wearing my only tailored blazer. I did not have an expensive Ivy League degree. I did not have a charismatic, overwhelming sales personality. But when the panel of directors handed me a dummy contract filled with deliberate, complex errors and gave me 45 minutes to audit it, I did not panic. I dismantled the document with the cold, precise efficiency of a surgeon. I found every single trap door. I found the conflicting clauses. I found the hidden auto-renewal penalties. They hired me on the spot as a mid-level risk analyst. The starting salary they offered was nearly double what I was making at Astral. Over the next 2 years, I climbed the corporate ladder at Helm Ridge, using the exact same personality traits that my family had historically used to sideline and dismiss me. My endless patience, which my parents always mistook for passivity, allowed me to easily outlast aggressive opposing counsel in tense negotiation rooms. My rigid meticulousness, which my family viewed as boring and neurotic, made me the most reliable, terrifyingly accurate auditor in my entire division. My absolute refusal to show off or demand the spotlight made me a trusted, essential confidant to the senior partners. I did not need to be the loudest voice in the room. I just needed to be the person holding the undisputed facts. With the rapid promotions came stability, real concrete stability. I was no longer agonizing over the price of basic groceries or terrified of a minor car repair destroying my life. The physical memory of freezing in my dark apartment slowly began to recede, replaced by the solid, comforting weight of actual financial security. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, during my lunch hour, I walked into a brightly lit bank branch 2 blocks from the Helm Ridge office tower. I sat down with a young teller and opened a brand new high-yield savings account. I did not link it to my checking account. I did not link it to anything. I named the account the emergency reserve. I pulled out my phone and transferred a flat $10,000 into the account as the initial foundational deposit. I watched the teller screen refresh. The bold black numbers appeared on the digital ledger. The money was locked away, an impenetrable shield against the unpredictable cruelty of the world. I walked out of the bank and stood on the busy sunlit sidewalk, letting the crowds of professionals rush past me. I took a deep, slow breath of the city air. For the first time in my entire life, I truly understood the concept my father had weaponized against me. Independence was not about being entirely alone or being physically cold or gritting your teeth through completely unnecessary suffering just to prove you could survive. True independence was the profound quiet luxury of never again having to beg for help from a place that had taught you to be deeply ashamed of simply having needs. It had been over a year since my silent withdrawal from the daily operations of the Simmons family. During that period of total radio silence, the glittering, highly curated facade of oral luxury Mitper began to show severe, irreparable structural fractures. The reality of commercial retail operations is brutal, entirely unforgiving, and completely indifferent to a perfectly filtered social media presence. Piper had built a massive business model predicated entirely on an endless loyal stream of wealthy clients who simply did not exist in her specific geographic radius. The fundamental math was broken from the very first day. The overhead costs were staggering. The monthly lease on her prime downtown retail space was astronomical, and the specialized maintenance contracts for her imported aesthetic laser machines drained capital faster than she could ever generate it. She continued posting flawless, perfectly lit photographs of herself holding a clipboard in the pristine marble-tiled lobby, projecting an aura of massive success. But those digital likes and enthusiastic comments did not generate actual deposit-ready revenue. They merely acted as a temporary psychological bandage over a gaping arterial cash wound. When the legitimate operating capital inevitably evaporated, Piper did exactly what people who refuse to acknowledge failure always do. She panicked and pivoted to the darkest corners of alternative financing. She began taking out merchant cash advances. These are not traditional loans granted by conservative bank officers. They are aggressive, highly predatory financial instruments that bypass standard underwriting and attach themselves directly to the daily credit card processing terminal of the business. Every single time a rare client actually paid for a chemical peel or a laser treatment, the alternative lender automatically siphoned off 30 or sometimes 40% of the transaction before the money ever reached Piper's business checking account. It created a terrifying, inescapable financial death spiral. When the severely diminished daily receipts failed to cover the exorbitant mandatory daily withdrawal minimums, Piper took out a second advance just to pay the first, and then a third advance to satisfy the second. She was actively rolling old toxic debt into brand new, even more toxic debt at effective annual interest rates that easily exceeded 100%. To maintain the illusion of control, she began actively intercepting the mail. She aggressively hid the neon-colored past due notices from the local utility companies. Far more dangerously, she buried the escalating warning letters from the federal government regarding her missing unremitted employee payroll taxes. Dean and Marlene were not innocent, oblivious bystanders who were suddenly ambushed by Piper's spectacular failure. They were active, willing participants in the delusion right up until the cliff edge crumbled beneath their feet. Whenever Piper's frantic shell game stumbled and a vendor aggressively threatened to repossess an expensive piece of equipment, she would drive out to the suburbs, sit at the kitchen island in Pfizer's and weep. She would claim that the market was just temporarily slow, that an aggressive new marketing campaign was about to launch, and that she merely needed one final small injection of cash to finally cross the threshold into pure profitability. Instead of demanding a forensic audit, instead of looking at the empty appointment books and forcing her to immediately close the doors and liquidate, my parents doubled down. They sat in their comfortable living room and enthusiastically signed another thick stack of legally binding addendums to save her for just one more financial quarter. They extended their home equity line of credit to its absolute maximum terrifying limit. They voluntarily transformed their own house, the physical manifestation of 3 decades of reliable middle-class labor, into collateral for a spectacular dream that was already dead on arrival. The total collapse finally breached the thick walls of their suburban denial when the commercial landlord formally filed a massive eviction lawsuit demanding 6 months of unpaid back rent. Simultaneously, the aggressive alternative financiers bypassed Piper entirely and began calling my parents' landline directly, explicitly threatening to aggressively execute the personal guarantees Dean had blindly signed. When the bank that held their primary mortgage sent the first official pre-foreclosure warning via certified mail, the reality of the situation finally shattered Dean's formidable pride. That was the exact moment he suddenly remembered his eldest daughter. When the legal threats began arriving on heavy watermarked paper filled with terrifying contractual jargon, he remembered that the daughter he had coldly exiled to the freezing winter was now a senior analyst in the contract risk division of a major corporate firm. He suddenly remembered that I understood exactly how these brutal mechanisms worked. During that brief, tense phone call while I sat in my parked car, Dean had not just asked for my administrative expertise. Before I cut him off and demanded the raw documentation, his sheer audacity had been breathtaking. He had casually laid out a demand for a massive financial bailout with the unearned confidence of a man completely accustomed to getting his way. He explained the aggressive timeline of the landlord and the financiers. Then he suggested that I could simply front them $25,000 to immediately halt the legal bleeding and satisfy the most aggressive sharks. He framed it as a minor temporary logistical necessity. He assumed that I would transfer the massive sum of money and then drive over to their house, organize the chaotic files, and use my professional skills to negotiate a more comfortable repayment structure with the remaining angry creditors. He presented this staggering demand without a single syllable of apology for the previous year. He did not acknowledge the profound agonizing hypocrisy of demanding $25,000 from me when he had ruthlessly refused to lend me a mere $2,400 to keep my apartment from freezing. In Dean's rigid, unwavering worldview, my hard-earned corporate salary, my professional competence, and my emotional stability were automatically classified as a communal family resource, available for immediate deployment whenever Piper faltered. My needs, my emergencies, and my survival, however, remained entirely my own isolated problems. I had brutally severed that expectation before it could even fully materialize. I told him in a flat, unrecognizable voice that I would not authorize a single wire transfer. I told him I would not even offer a single word of professional advice until I possessed the complete, unfiltered anatomy of the disaster. The list of documents I demanded was deliberately exhaustive and highly invasive. I required the original commercial lease agreement and every single subsequent amendment regarding default penalties. I demanded the fully executed copies of the personal guarantees my parents had signed, specifically searching for the clauses that waived their right to contest a property lien. I demanded 12 consecutive months of unedited bank statements for every single account holding the Simmons family name. I asked for the state and federal tax returns, the payroll remittance logs, the original equipment financing contracts, and the complete panicked email correspondence between Piper and her various frustrated vendors. Dean had sighed heavily into the receiver, sounding exactly like a put-upon manager dealing with an overly bureaucratic, difficult employee. He accused me of being unnecessarily clinical, of treating my own flesh and blood like a hostile corporate entity. He complained that gathering and scanning that immense volume of paperwork would take days of agonizing effort. But he had absolutely no leverage left. The wolves were actively destroying the front door, and I was the only person in the entire world offering even a conditional sliver of a lifeline. He ultimately capitulated with extreme reluctance. He genuinely believed that my demand for documentation was just a temporary emotional hurdle. He firmly assumed that once I saw the raw, terrifying reality of my parents standing on the absolute brink of total financial ruin, my deeply ingrained, lifelong childhood conditioning would automatically reactivate. He thought I would immediately soften, revert to my designated role as the obedient family shield, and drain my emergency savings account to protect them from the brutal consequences of their own actions. He spent the next 48 solid hours frantically scanning and uploading hundreds of pages of chaotic, damning financial history to the secure digital folder I had provided. He thought he was simply surrendering to a family member who would quietly sweep the massive mess under the rug. He had absolutely no idea that he was willingly handing over a mountain of undisputed, legally binding evidence to the only person in the family who was finally awake enough to refuse to fold. He was delivering the weapon directly into my hands, completely unaware that I fully intended to use it to permanently dismantle the machine. The digital files arrived from my father in a massive chaotic zip folder containing hundreds of mislabeled scans. I drove to a local print shop and paid to have every single page physically printed. My small round dining table completely disappeared beneath uneven towering stacks of commercial leases, bank statements, past due notices, and vendor correspondence. For 5 consecutive nights, I barely slept. I sat under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead kitchen light fixture, armed with a fresh pot of black coffee and a brand new pack of multicolored highlighters. I was not reading these documents like a terrified daughter frantically searching for a miracle to save her parents. I was reading them exactly like the senior contract risk analyst I had become. I was executing a forensic autopsy on a rotting financial nervous system. First, I focused my attention entirely on the Medbers operating accounts and daily ledgers. My sister had not simply failed due to a sudden economic downturn or a slow local market. She had actively, deliberately manufactured her own catastrophic collapse through sheer arrogance and financial illiteracy. Using a bright, yellow highlighter, I meticulously tracked the erratic flow of incoming capital. She had aggressively pre-sold luxury treatment packages to her few actual clients, collecting hefty cash deposits upfront for services scheduled months in the future. But instead of holding those specific funds in a restricted, untouchable escrow account to cover the eventual cost of the labor and supplies, she had immediately commingled the money into her general unprotected operating fund. I traced those exact deposit amounts using a pink highlighter. The money flowed straight out the back door just as quickly as it arrived. She used the unearned cash to pay for custom floral arrangements for the lobby, high-end organic, catered lunches for her tiny staff, and exorbitant monthly retainers for a boutique social media marketing agency that produced nothing but perfectly filtered photographs. She was literally using unearned liabilities to fund shallow visual vanity projects that generated absolutely zero actual cash flow. She was aggressively bankrupting herself just to look wealthy on the internet. Then I turned my attention to the heavy, dense commercial leasing and financing documents. My parents had spent the last 2 weeks playing the role of naive, helpless victims who had simply co-signed a standard everyday business loan to gently support a daughter's dream. But the paper trail told a far darker, far more complicit story. I found 3 separate commercial lease addendums and 2 massive punishing forbearance agreements from the alternative lending companies. My father's bold looping signature and my mother's neat, careful cursive were right there, stamped on the bottom line of every single one of those lethal documents. They had not just signed the initial setup paperwork blindly and walked away. As the business began to visibly hemorrhage money 6 months prior, the commercial landlord and the predatory lenders had aggressively demanded additional ironclad collateral to keep the doors open. My parents had willingly signed away their legal rights to contest a property lien on their primary residence. They knew exactly how incredibly high the stakes were. They clearly saw the terrifying penalty fees and the astronomical interest rates printed in bold, undeniable ink. Yet, they actively chose to double down anyway because their desperate, pathological need to believe in the golden child heavily outweighed their basic sense of adult self-preservation. The most devastating revelation, however, did not emerge from the recent corporate failure files. It arrived hidden entirely by accident, tucked inside a chaotic, unlabeled digital scan of my father's home office filing cabinet. He had been so panicked, so utterly desperate to comply with my strict demand for full transparency, that he had blindly grabbed massive stacks of old banking records and fed them directly into the scanner without checking the contents. Buried between a decade-old joint tax return and a void auto insurance policy, I found a scanned copy of an old, slightly faded manila envelope. The banking letterhead belonged to a regional institution our family had briefly used when I was a teenager. I zoomed in tightly on the document on my laptop screen. It was a final distribution statement from a private trust account. The beneficiary name printed clearly on the top line was mine. The total liquid asset value of the account was exactly $18,000. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The ambient air in my apartment suddenly felt impossibly thin and cold. I remembered that specific amount of money. When my maternal grandmother passed away during my freshman year of community college, my mother had sat me down in our pristine suburban living room. She held my hand, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and told me in a remarkably steady voice that while my grandmother had always intended to leave me a small dedicated college fund, the brutal reality of end-of-life hospice care and mounting medical debts had completely evaporated the estate. She looked me directly in the eyes and told me there was absolutely nothing left. I had accepted the story without a single question. I had worked exhausting double shifts at the medical billing firm to pay for my own heavy textbooks while grieving my grandmother in complete silence. But the official indisputable bank ledger staring back at me from my screen proved that the money had never evaporated. The $18,000 had been successfully transferred into a custodial account legally controlled by my parents. I scrolled down with a trembling finger to view the withdrawal history. The entire sum had been quietly liquidated in a single massive cashier check. I checked the official timestamp on the final withdrawal. It was dated the exact same week of the exact same month years ago, when my sister had dramatically dropped out of her first expensive cosmetology academy and immediately demanded a massive new tuition payment for the elite esthetician school. My parents had not just favored her emotionally. They had not just prioritized her endless dreams over my basic practical needs. They had quietly, systematically stolen the only real financial head start I had ever been given. They used my inheritance to quietly pave over my sister's first massive failure. And then they looked me directly in the eyes and lied to my face about it for over a decade. The betrayal was so incredibly profound, so surgically precise, that it completely severed the last invisible frayed thread of familial obligation tying me to them. This was no longer just a sad story about foolish parents who loved one child slightly too much. This was a fully documented, undeniable history of financial cannibalism. I pushed my chair back from the table. My hands were trembling violently, not from sorrow, but from a cold, absolute rage that burned with a terrifying, liberating clarity. I picked up my phone from the counter and dialed Rowan's number. He answered on the second ring. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply read the specific dates and the precise numbers to him in a flat, mechanical voice. I explained the theft of the $18,000. I explained the willing signatures on the ruinous commercial addendums. Rowan listened to the entire clinical breakdown in total silence. I could hear the faint, steady hum of the refrigerator in his apartment through the speaker. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady anchor in the chaotic storm of my anger. "They used you as a salvage yard," he said quietly, his tone completely devoid of judgment, but heavy with absolute truth. "They stripped your parts to keep her engine running. If you step in now, Gianner, you cannot do it the way they expect. If you help them, you have to help them in a way that permanently ends this specific model of survival. Do not write a single check just to help this sickness live another year." He was absolutely right. A massive unconditional cash injection would just temporarily reset the board, allowing my family to comfortably continue their toxic parasitic game. If I was going to enter the arena, I was going to rewrite the fundamental rules of engagement entirely. The next morning, I did not call my father to negotiate. Instead, I bypassed my family entirely and contacted a senior contract litigator I frequently collaborated with at Helm Ridge Vendor Solutions. I explained the exact architecture of the family debt, the impending bank foreclosure timeline, and the specific physical assets still in play. I paid his exorbitant hourly retainer fee directly out of my own fiercely guarded emergency savings account. I sat in his sleek glass-walled downtown office for 3 hours and dictated a highly aggressive, legally binding set of conditions. We drafted a multi-page operational agreement. The document was completely devoid of any emotional language, stripping away the hazy, manipulative fob of family loyalty and replacing it entirely with the rigid, unforgiving steel of contract law. I was no longer the obedient, overlooked daughter, desperately hoping to finally earn their respect. I was the hostile creditor possessing the only remaining life raft, and I was stepping into the wreckage strictly on my own terms. The era of my silent sacrifice was officially over. If they wanted my money to save their house, they were going to have to sign their names in black and white and surrender completely to the truth. I did not drive back to the suburbs of Pfizer's. For 3 decades, that colonial house with the pristine vinyl siding had been the designated courtroom for all internal family disputes, a comfortable venue where my father perpetually sat as the unquestioned judge. Today, I completely changed the jurisdiction. I scheduled the meeting for 2:00 on a Thursday afternoon at the downtown offices of my contract litigator. The conference room we occupied was aggressively sterile. It smelled faintly of expensive glass cleaner and chilled recirculated air. There were no comfortable floral sofas or warm family photographs to soften the harsh reality of the situation. There was only a massive polished mahogany table surrounded by heavy leather chairs that forced everyone to sit up perfectly straight and face the consequences of their actions. Dean and Marlin arrived exactly on time. My father walked through the heavy glass doors wearing a crisp, casual golf shirt, projecting the relaxed, manufactured confidence of a man who firmly believed he was attending a minor administrative formality. He smiled a tight paternal smile, clearly expecting me to slide a blank check across the table with a reassuring nod so we could keep this ugly business discreetly within the family. Marlene hovered nervously behind him, her hands clasping her purse entirely too tightly, her eyes darting around the intimidating corporate environment. Piper, remaining utterly true to her fundamental nature, arrived exactly 20 minutes late. She swept into the silent, tense room, wearing a pristine tailored beige trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses, holding the plastic cup of artisanal iced coffee. She had dressed defensively, applying immaculate makeup and styling her golden hair as if projecting a flawless image of wealth could somehow magically negotiate away a federal tax lien. She looked like she was arriving for a high-end magazine interview rather than a grim financial execution. I did not stand up to greet them. I sat rigidly beside my attorney, a silent, imposing man in a tailored suit who simply observed the dynamics. I did not ask about the afternoon traffic or offer any polite small talk. The moment Piper pulled out a chair and finally settled in, I reached out and slid 3 thick, meticulously organized binders across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table. They stopped directly in front of my father. I watched his confident, easygoing smile waver slightly at the sheer physical volume of the paper. I pointed to the first binder. "That is the absolute reality of your current liability. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying across the silent room with the lethal precision of a sniper. "It contains every single outstanding debt, the accumulated late fees, the merchant cash advance penalties, and the accelerated foreclosure timeline. It is the exact mathematical measurement of the hole you dug." I pointed to the second binder. "That is a comprehensive inventory of every single tangible asset you all still possess that holds any actual liquid market value." I let my finger drift to the third thinnest binder. "And that is the operational agreement. Those are the strict non-negotiable terms under which I will intervene and save your house." Dean chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed poorly in the glass room. He reached for the third binder with the casual arrogance of a parent indulging a dramatic, overly serious child. He flicked open the heavy cover. He began to read the top page. The silence in the room stretched until it felt physically suffocating. I watched the blood slowly drain from his cheeks, rapidly replaced by a mottled rising flush of absolute indignation. I did not let him formulate a defense. I recited the terms directly from memory. "Condition 1, I stated, locking my eyes entirely on my father. "I will not wire a single dollar into any personal checking account controlled by anyone sitting at this table. Every single cent of my capital will be transferred directly into a blind legal trust managed exclusively by this law firm. My attorney will disperse the funds directly to the commercial landlord and the mortgage lender. You will not touch the money. You will not manage the money. You will not suddenly decide to divert a portion of it to float another month of payroll for a failed clinic." I turned my gaze to my sister. Her oversized sunglasses were now resting on the table, revealing eyes that were wide and suddenly terrified. "Condition 2, I continued, my tone entirely devoid of any residual sisterly affection. "Piper, you will immediately surrender the keys to your least luxury sport utility vehicle. You will contact the secondary medical suppliers tomorrow morning and voluntarily surrender every single piece of unrepossessed aesthetic equipment currently sitting in your lobby. Furthermore, you will sign a legally binding document permanently severing your access as an authorized user on every single credit card, checking account, and line of credit associated with our parents." "The financial umbilical cord is severed today," Piper gasped, pressing a manicured hand against her chest, as if she had been physically struck by a heavy object. "You cannot do that," she stammered, her voice trembling with genuine, unadulterated outrage. "How am I supposed to get to job interviews? How am I supposed to start over without a car or my machines?" I stared at her completely blankly. "You will ride the municipal bus. You will work. You will learn the exact same logistical realities I learned when my car broke down 2 winters ago, and I was forced to walk 3 miles in the freezing sleet." I turned back to my parents. Marlene was staring at the polished wood of the table, her face entirely pale, looking physically ill. "Condition 3, I said, dropping my voice to an hasty, unforgiving register. "The final document in that folder is a formal admission of debt. It clearly states that exactly $18,000 was legally transferred to me upon the death of my grandmother. It also clearly documents that you two knowingly and deliberately liquidated that specific trust to pay for a failed cosmetology program and subsequently lied to my face about the existence of those funds for over a decade. You will sign my admission today. It includes a mandatory legally enforceable repayment schedule that activates the exact moment this immediate foreclosure crisis is resolved." The room erupted. Dean slammed his heavy right hand down onto the mahogany table. The sharp, violent crack echoed aggressively against the glass walls. He rose halfway out of his leather chair, leaning over the binders, his face contorted with a volatile mixture of profound shame and absolute furious disbelief. "This is insane," Dean rawed, completely abandoning his calm, patriarchal facade. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "We are your family. We gave you life. You dragged us down to this sterile corporate office to interrogate us like we are common criminals. You are treating your own mother and father like hostile, untrustworthy clients who are trying to rip you off." I did not flinch. I did not lean back in my chair or look away. I simply mirrored his aggressive posture, leaning forward until our faces were merely 2 feet apart across the polished wood. I looked directly into the furious, panicked eyes of the man who had casually left me to freeze in the dark. "You turned me into a lesson," I said. Every single syllable fell like a heavy iron weight onto a glass floor. "Now I am turning this into a process." The fight instantly drained out of him. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. For the first time in 34 years of existence, Dean Simmons frantically searched his entire psychological arsenal and realized he had absolutely nothing left to fire. He could not guilt me. He could not shame me. He could not command me. The sheer terrifying weight of my financial leverage had completely crushed his parental authority into dust. He slowly sank back into his heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the meticulous, merciless paperwork waiting for his signature. The meeting was not officially concluded, but the stalemate was broken. The king was trapped in the corner of the board, and for the very first time in his life, he realized he could not simply flip the table to avoid losing the game. The days following the conference room standoff felt like a violently compressed spring, tightening with every passing hour until the pressure became almost unbearable. The bank did not care about our complex family dynamics or my father's bruised ego. The legal machinery of debt collection ground forward, entirely indifferent to the suburban illusions of Pfizer's Indiana. On a grim Tuesday morning, a sheriff's deputy walked up the perfectly edged lawn and taped a brightly colored, legally binding notice of public auction directly to the front door of my parents' house. The quiet, respectable facade was officially dead for the entire neighborhood to see. Instantly, the psychological warfare escalated. My phone began to ring incessantly, not just from my immediate family, but from the distant extended branches of the family tree. Relatives who had not spoken a single word to me in over 5 years suddenly felt incredibly entitled to aggressively critique my moral compass. An aunt left a rambling, tearful voicemail accusing me of abandoning basic Christian charity. An uncle sent a stern, poorly spelled email lecturing me about the biblical command to honor my father and mother. They were completely blind to the actual financial math. They only saw a cold corporate niece ruthlessly squeezing her desperate, loving parents while their home was being ripped away. Every single call was designed to add another heavy layer of manufactured guilt onto my shoulders. My mother broke first. Marlene called me on a Thursday evening, sobbing so hysterically into the receiver that I could barely decipher her frantic words. She begged me to simply release the funds without the draconian legal conditions. She wailed that the house held every single precious memory our family had ever made, completely ignoring the glaring fact that my primary childhood memory of that house was learning how to be entirely invisible. Dean took a vastly different approach. His phone call was brief, entirely devoid of any paternal warmth, and thick with bitter, defensive resentment. "You are deliberately making things difficult while the house is literally on fire," he growled, his voice vibrating with anger. He still firmly believed I was simply playing a cruel, vindictive powered game, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge that he was the one who had willingly poured gasoline all over his own living room. Then came Piper's relentless digital assault. Having permanently lost the protective shield of our father's immediate defense in the lawyer's office, she resorted to her most trusted, deeply ingrained weapon, playing the ultimate tragic victim. She flooded my phone with massive blocks of text messages at 2:00 in the morning. She accused me of being a cold-blooded sociopath. She claimed she only took those catastrophic loans to build a massive empire so our parents could eventually retire in absolute luxury, painting her financial recklessness as an act of noble sacrifice. And then the ultimate venomous truth she had always harbored finally spilled out onto the glowing screen. "You are just doing this to punish me," she typed, the digital words practically dripping with malice. "You have always hated me because they actually loved me more, and you were just the boring one who had to pay the bills." I did not reply to a single message. I let them exhaust their emotional ammunition against the stone wall of my total silence. The fatal blow to their resistance, however, did not come from my spreadsheets or my silence. It came from the meticulous, sweeping digital surveillance my attorney had legally established over their chaotic banking accounts. On Friday morning, exactly 48 hours before the bank's absolute point of no return, My phone vibrated with an urgent call from my legal counsel. His voice was sharper, moving much faster than usual, while Dean was angrily accusing me of being unreasonable, and while Marlene was weeping over family photo albums, Piper was actively executing her final desperate scam. My lawyer had flagged a highly suspicious pending wire transfer. Piper was attempting to quietly drain the very last few thousand of legitimate retail revenue from the medical spa's primary operating account. She was trying to move it into a brand new, completely hidden online banking account untethered from the business, actively hiding assets from the commercial landlord and from me. The betrayal did not stop there. She had just submitted a fresh expedited digital application for a massive high-interest unsecured credit card. The primary applicant listed on the digital form was not Piper Simmons. She had used Dean's social security number, Dean's date of birth, and Dean's forged digital signature to secure a new line of credit just hours after sitting in that conference room and watching him face total humiliating ruin. Even as the physical house was actively slipping away, even as her father was preparing to sell his prized possessions to save her, her only instinct was to find another financial vein to tap. She was willing to steal his actual identity to fund her lifestyle for one more month. I drafted a formal, legally binding email and sent it directly to my father, my mother, and my sister simultaneously. The subject line was entirely blank. The body contained exactly 3 sentences. I clinically outlined the intercepted wire transfer and the fraudulent forged credit application. I stated clearly that absolutely every single offer of financial assistance was immediately and permanently withdrawn unless Piper signed the total relinquishment agreement and surrendered every single piece of physical business equipment within exactly 24 hours. I hit send, placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter, and walked away. What happened next in that suburban house was later relayed to me by Rowan, who had heard the frantic, echoing aftermath through a brief, panicked phone call from Marlene. That Friday night, the grand enduring myth of the Simmons family violently shattered into 1,000 pieces in the middle of their spotless kitchen. When Dean read my email on his tablet and saw the undeniable hard proof of Piper's active ongoing identity theft against him, the final heavy curtain fell. He did not step in front of her. He did not offer a gentle enabling excuse about her being under too much pressure. For the very first time in his entire life, he turned the full terrifying weight of his anger away from me and aimed it directly at the golden child he had ruined himself to protect. The neighbors heard the shouting through the closed double-pane windows. He was no longer the calm, patriarchal manager distributing life lessons. He was a broken, rapidly aging man who suddenly realized that his endless, unconditional favoritism had not created a successful female entrepreneur. It had successfully cultivated a remorseless parasite that would gladly step on his neck to keep her own head above the water. In a voice that shook the walls, Dean forced her to hand over the electronic keys to the leased luxury vehicle right there on the kitchen island, demanding she pack her bags and leave his house. While the foundation of the house literally shook with the unprecedented sound of Dean holding Piper entirely accountable, Marlene was frantically emptying the old oak filing cabinets in the den, desperately searching for any missing vendor contracts to satisfy my strict 24-hour deadline. Deep in the back of the bottom drawer, wedged tightly beneath a thick stack of expired home insurance policies from a decade ago, her fingers brushed against a thick sealed parchment envelope. It was addressed to me. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and unmistakably belonged to my maternal grandmother. It was a letter that my parents had deliberately intercepted, hidden, and never delivered on the exact same week they had quietly liquidated my $18,000 inheritance. Marlene opened the sealed flap with trembling hands. She did not find a sweet, sentimental goodbye. My grandmother was a sharp, fiercely observant woman who had clearly seen the toxic, unbalanced dynamics of our family long before I ever had the adult vocabulary to accurately describe them. Marlene slowly carried the open letter into the kitchen, her face entirely devoid of color, interrupting the bitter, screaming match between my father and my sister. She handed the heavy parchment to Dean without speaking a single word. The fight died instantly. He took the paper and read the elegant cursive writing silently. My grandmother had written extensively about the money she was leaving me, specifically stating it was meant to be my armor against a family that would inevitably try to consume my energy and my resources. But the final paragraph contained a single devastating sentence that tore through my father's lifelong philosophy like a hollow point bullet. She had written, "They will tell you that you must always be strong, and your father will tell you that you must learn independence. But remember this above all else, Gianna, true independence does not mean you are required to suffer their injustice in absolute silence." That single profound sentence echoing from a dead woman struck Dean with a physical force that my color-coded spreadsheets and aggressive legal threats could never achieve. It was the exact phrase he had weaponized against me during the freezing winter, completely dismantled, stripped of its righteous authority, and turned back against him by his own mother-in-law. The profound, inescapable shame of what he had done, of the theft he had justified, and of the capable daughter he had sacrificed on the altar of his own pride, finally brought the judge to his knees. The final meeting took place on a rainy Tuesday morning, precisely 72 hours after the shattering confrontation in my parents' kitchen. We gathered once again in the sterile glass-walled conference room of my attorney's downtown office. This time, however, the heavy mahogany table was more crowded. Two stern representatives from the primary mortgage lender sat across from us, their briefcases open, their expressions molded into masks of professional indifference. This was the absolute zero hour. We were here to officially determine whether the physical structure of my childhood would be auctioned off to the highest bidder by the county sheriff, or if a brutal, heavily monitored restructuring agreement could be reached. The man who walked into the room that morning was not the same Dean Simmons who had arrogantly dismissed me just a few days prior. He looked visibly diminished, as if the suffocating weight of the past weekend had physically compressed his spine. He did not wear a crisp golf shirt or project an aura of suburban authority. He wore a faded, slightly wrinkled button-down, but the most profound change was not in his posture. It was in his ledgers. Before sitting down, my father handed a manila folder to my attorney. Over the excruciating span of 48 hours, Dean had systematically dismantled the physical monuments of his ego. He had sold his beloved vintage speedboat to a local dealer at a punishingly steep discount. He had liquidated his pristine, highly curated collection of expensive hunting equipment. He had emptied the garage of his woodworking tools and surrendered the remaining balance of his personal untouchable savings account. He had finally painfully amputated the symbols of his patriarchal pride to stop the bleeding he had caused. Marlene sat quietly beside him. When my attorney slid the formal debt acknowledgement across the polished wood, she did not hesitate. She did not attempt to soften the blow with maternal tears or weave a narrative about misunderstandings. She picked up the heavy black pen and signed her legal name, officially recognizing the theft of my $18,000 inheritance. She transformed the decades old family secret into a legally binding, interest-bearing promissory note. Then it was Piper's turn. She sat at the far end of the table, looking incredibly small. There was no designer trench coat today, no oversized sunglasses to hide behind. She looked exhausted. My attorney pushed a thick stack of aggressively stapled documents toward her. These were the formal articles of corporate dissolution. By signing them, she was legally severing her name from oral luxury medper forever. She was voluntarily surrendering the last of the expensive aesthetic machines to the alternative lenders. And most importantly, she was permanently terminating her status as an authorized user on every single financial account connected to our parents. For the very first time in her entire life, Piper looked at my mother and father silently, begging for an intervention. She waited for Dean to slam his hand on the table and declare that they would find another way. She waited for Marlene to offer a secret credit card. They gave her nothing. They simply stared at the table. Her safety net had been completely ruthlessly vaporized. With a shaking hand, Piper signed the papers, effectively executing her own fabricated empire. Once the surrenders were complete, I made my move. I did not write a blank check to wipe the slate clean. I authorized my attorney to wire a highly specific, precisely calculated sum of money directly from my emergency reserves into the firm's blind trust. It was not enough to pay off Piper's catastrophic commercial debts. I completely vehemently refused to subsidize her vanity project. The funds I provided were strictly calculated to cure the immediate mortgage default, satisfy the aggressive alternative lenders just enough to hold the property lien, and buy my parents a 12-month window to negotiate a grueling long-term repayment plan for the rest. I was not buying their freedom. I was merely purchasing them, the opportunity to slowly dig their own way out. The bank representatives reviewed the wire transfer confirmation, nodded curtly, and signed the forbearance agreement. The house was temporarily safe. The crushing immediate threat of the sheriff's auction was lifted. As the bank representatives packed their leather briefcases and exited the glass room, a heavy, exhausted silence descended upon the family. We were still sitting at the table, surrounded by the physical wreckage of our history. It was in that lingering, fragile quiet that Piper made her final, desperate play. She turned her chair slightly, refusing to look at my parents, and locked her eyes directly onto mine, her expression twisted into a practiced, pleading mask. "Ganner," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured vulnerability, "I know I messed up. I know I ruined everything, but I have a new business plan, an entirely online consulting agency. No overhead, no expensive leases. I just need a tiny bit of startup capital to build the website and run some targeted ads. Just 3,000 or 4,000. I swear to you I will be different this time. You have the money, please. Just one small loan to help me start over." The entire conference room went dead silent. The sheer unadulterated audacity of her request hung in the chilled air, toxic and heavy. She had learned absolutely nothing. Even sitting in the ashes of the inferno she had ignited, her only instinct was to search my pockets for another match. I did not raise my voice. I did not express anger. I simply looked at my younger sister, studying the desperate entitlement etched into her features. Then I slowly shifted my gaze down the length of the mahogany table, looking directly into the exhausted, defeated eyes of my father. I held his stare for a long, terrible moment, letting the weight of the past 2 years settle between us. I turned back to Piper. "Dad was right," I said. My voice was calm, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of mercy. "Learn independence." Piper recoiled as if I had struck her across the face. She whipped her head toward Dean, fully expecting him to finally leap to her defense, to chastise my cruelty, to demand that family must support family. Dean Simmons looked at his youngest daughter. He looked at the empty spaces where his pride and his assets used to be. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a physical surrender. "She is right," Dean said softly, his voice barely carrying across the room. He did not look at me when he said it, but he did not have to. The truth was finally, permanently installed. The aftermath of that Tuesday morning did not result in a cinematic, tearful family embrace. Real life does not neatly resolve itself in a single afternoon. Over the next 8 months, my parents strictly adhered to the punishing terms of the operational agreement. Every 30 days, without fail, a direct deposit appeared in my checking account, slowly chipping away at the massive debt they owed me. Our relationship did not immediately return to normal because the old normal was fundamentally toxic. Instead, we began to build something entirely new, something slow, cautious, and rooted in actual reality rather than convenient illusions. When Dean called me now, he did not demand my services. He asked about my day. Piper, completely cut off from the endless flow of parental capital, was forced into a reality she had successfully avoided for over a decade. She rented a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a much less desirable neighborhood. For the first time in her life, she took a standard hourly wage job working the reception desk at a corporate gym. She learned the agonizingly slow math of earning a living 1 hour at a time. As for me, I did not stay in my small, lonely apartment. A year after the crisis, Ron and I pulled our resources and purchased a modest, beautiful brick townhouse on the quiet edge of the city. It had excellent heating, reliable plumbing, and a small garden in the back. When we moved in, I unpacked a specific box first. I took the heavy parchment letter written by my grandmother, the one that had finally broken the spell in my parents' kitchen, and I had it professionally mounted in a thick oak frame. I hung it directly in the entryway of our new home. It hangs there today, a constant physical reminder greeting me every single time I walk through the front door. It reminds me that the most expensive, most valuable lesson I'd ever learned was not simply how to survive the freezing cold by myself. The true lesson was learning how to stop allowing the concept of family to be weaponized to legitimize my own mistreatment. I finally learned what independence truly meant, and more importantly, I finally taught them exactly what it cost. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. I would absolutely love to hear where you are tuning in from. So, please leave a comment down below telling me your city or country so we can interact and share our thoughts on Gianna's journey. If you enjoyed this experience, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video and support the channel even further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. Thanks to all.